Next film that we'll be showing is Framing and Execution by Danny Glover. But to introduce that film, it gives me great honor and pleasure to introduce to you one of our youngest members and determined members of the Mumia Coalition, Isabel Ross Rivero.
The film that you're about to watch is the Fraternal Order Police collaboration with ABC, Sam Donaldson in particular, in the late 90s, yeah. The present of the lies of the prosecution and the police on Mumia's case to hide that collaboration and to present Mumia's supporters as Ed Answer as the actor, and Mumia's lawyer. At the time, the now deceased well-known attorney, Len Weinglass, in the most negative light possible. A similar collaboration between Fox News and the Fraternal Order of Police just took place a few weeks ago with Johanna Fernandez, and we held protest press conferences at Fox News, both in Philly and New York. So enjoy the film.
The case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, a Philadelphia journalist, convicted and sentenced to death in 1981 for the murder of police officer Daniel Faulkner, has been at the center of unprecedented public concern in the last few years. Many people believe that the trial which led to his conviction and death sentence was deeply unfair, and that a new trial is needed to fairly assess Jamal's guilt or innocence. This call for a retrial has been the centerpiece of many marches and demonstrations in the United States and around the world. At the same time, the largest police organization in the country, the Fraternal Order of Police, has launched a vigorous campaign to have Mumia's conviction and death sentence carried out as quickly as possible. Until recently, the mainstream media has not paid much attention to this case. But in the last few years, a number of media outlets, such as Vanity Fair, Time Magazine, and ABC News, has given it some attention. In this program, we're going to examine the way the mainstream media have chosen to tell the story of this controversial case. And we're going to ask important questions about the responsibility that journalists have when it comes to issues of life and death. The controversy surrounding the case is based on the events of December 9, 1981, when Mumia Abu-Jamal, a radio journalist well known to the police because of his sharp criticism of them in their dealing with the black community, was working as a cab driver. He was parked on the streets of Philadelphia in the early hours when Officer Faulkner pulled over a car driven by Jamal's brother, William Cook. There's widespread agreement that there was a physical altercation between the two, that Jamal ran toward them, and that he had with him a licensed .38 revolver. A number of shots were fired, at the end of which Jamal lay seriously injured with a chest wound, and Officer Faulkner was dead, shot twice in the back and the face. But after that, everything is disputed between the prosecution and the defense in terms of who did the shooting and the surrounding circumstances. The issue is, what is the responsibility of the news media and journalists when it comes to controversial cases such as this?
If you're going to cover something that's very controversial, that there's been a lot of debate about, and particularly in this case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, you're talking about a trial where you have very clearly two sides laid out, as it were, to a story. If you're going to go for that kind of story, then I think you have a special burden as a journalist to be fair-minded. In other words, to present how would a reasonable person come to accept this perspective?
Because of the large audience that it commands, over 9 million people a week, we are going to pay particular attention to the way that the ABC program 2020 covered this case.
Is this man a cold-blooded killer or America's last political prisoner? The compelling story of Hollywood's unlikely hero.
Instead of a dispassionate investigation into the facts that were promised, we see the story framed right at the top in the most dramatic terms as a widow's quest for justice.
On a cold December day in 1981, Maureen Faulkner buried her husband, Officer Daniel Faulkner. But for 17 years, there has been no closure because of the voice that won't go away.
I was driving to work one day, and all of a sudden I heard this voice, this haunting voice.
Promise death, the election is yours.
And I could not believe that it was Jamal on the radio doing this commentary. I began to shake because I was so upset.
Since that day, a few years ago, Maureen Faulkner has waged a crusade against the Free Mumia campaign.
Now, there's no doubt that Mrs. Faulkner deserves our sympathy, as would anyone losing a loved one, including Mumia's family. But what we want to consider here is her critical role in this story as a rhetorical device. It's important to understand why she's portrayed here as part heroine and part damsel in distress. It may be because she's a far more sympathetic character than the Fraternal Order of Police, for instance, the organization which is the real power behind the national campaign to execute Mumia. Now, to make a good fairy tale, of course, with reporter Donaldson gallantly coming to the widow's aid, we must have a villain set against her cause. And in this case, the person who is cast in that role is the lawyer then handling Mumia's appeal, civil rights attorney Leonard Weinglass. To hear from people on both sides of an issue is basic journalism. But what's unusual in this case is that Maureen Faulkner, as spokesperson for one side, is given the privilege of characterizing the other side without being challenged.
Leonard Weinglass is a liar.
Maureen Faulkner is the slain officer's widow.
Have you looked over the evidence that Leonard Weinglass says would prove that Jamal was innocent?
Yes, I have.
There's no substance to it?
No. He has duped the world into believing that this man is a political prisoner and is innocent of the crime charged, when that is not the case.
There's this presentation of this as a kind of David and Goliath story in which the prosecution, people who support the death penalty for Mumia, believe he killed Daniel Faulkner. These people are a small band of people who are fighting this more powerful and larger force.
You're up against a very impressive number of people.
I know, I am. But I believe that I have the truth on my side. Mumia is nothing but a cold-blooded murderer.
It's very revealing that it's fully 5 minutes into a 20-minute program before anyone who represents Mumia, his lawyer, is allowed to speak. And when Leonard Weinglass does speak, Sam Donaldson is very confrontational in his questioning, interrupting him constantly. And the editing techniques that are used are designed to make it appear as if he's being evasive and squirming under Donaldson's relentless pursuit of the truth.
The police say that that slug has the lands and grooves consistent with being a .38 slug. It does. But if it's a .38, then you're contention that the 44 is wrong.
Well, I think that issue is very much something that should be played out in front of a jury.
But it has already been played out in front of a judge.
The other major device that sets the context for the report is the idea that Mumia is Hollywood's unlikely hero, and that although a number of liberal celebrities have taken up the case, they don't really know the facts and are about to be surprised by 2020's tough investigative reporting.
So why have some of the most recognized names in entertainment and politics taken up his cause?
But what is it about this case? He has generated international fervor, support from all kinds of celebrities and politicians. Do they know the whole story? Are they in for a surprise?
Well, Diane, they could be.
So when ABC 2020 made the decision that this was not going to be a story about a trial, a highly problematic trial that quite possibly represents a violation of justice. Instead, the story was going to be framed as a cause célèbre, you know, Hollywood's unlikeliest hero, a Hollywood story. That is a signal then also to other journalists, to other media outlets, that this is the category of story this is. This is a story about a person who has incited a lot of passions among activists, and particularly African Americans, and there's a lot of emotion. It's an emotional story. Right away, that sends journalists the signal that it's not really a legal story, it's not really a serious story, it's really a story about the Hollywood left.
There are a number of ways to approach this case. One way could be how many supporters of a new trial frame the issue, that they are not sure if Mumia is guilty or innocent, but that the trial he received in 1981 was patently unfair, and that a new trial is necessary for justice to be served. So there could be a series of questions asked about the fairness of his original trial. Or you could ignore the issue of the fairness of the trial and concentrate instead on asking whether Mumia is guilty or innocent of the crime. In a controversial case such as this, a responsible journalist might give equal time to each of these issues. What does Sam Donaldson do? He ignores the issue of the fairness of the trial and adopts instead the prosecution case. In fact, he actually allows the very same prosecutor of the case to define the story with his version of highly disputed facts.
What you have is eyewitness testimony, not one, but three. You have a weapon, clear. And later, at a hospital, he blurts out what he did in an arrogant way.
It is clear that 2020 has accepted the prosecution's overall frame as a way to approach this case. But within this, there's still a lot of room to make sure that both sides of the argument about what happened that December night in 1981 are presented fairly. On the question of witnesses, for example, the prosecution and the defense present very different arguments. The prosecution rests this case on three witnesses, who they claim all saw Mumia shoot Officer Faulkner. In contrast, the defense presents 5 other witnesses who saw something different. Moreover, the defense claims that at least 2 of these witnesses were coerced by the police to change their stories. Additionally, the defense claims that at least 2 of the witnesses on the prosecution side may have also been threatened to tell an untrue story that implicated Mumia. So, how does 2020 treat these 2 very different ways of framing eyewitnesses?
3 eyewitnesses, one stopped in that intersection, one standing on a corner there, and one sitting in a cab here, right behind the squad car, all say they saw Jamal run from across the street and shoot the officer in the back. As the officer spun round, he grabbed his revolver, and as he fell to the sidewalk, fired a shot that wounded Jamal in the chest. It was then that Jamal, according to the witnesses, executed Officer Faulkner.
Nothing more is said about the prosecution witnesses, other than they all saw Mumia, in Donaldson's words, execute Officer Faulkner. Is this true?
There are lots of stories in which you can accuse journalists of being sloppy, of leaving out certain facts, or of not perhaps including every source that they might have This case of 2020 and Mumia Abu-Jamal is not that. This is an instance in which direct lies are made, statements which are simply not statements of fact. All three eyewitnesses say they saw the same thing. That's simply not true.
Given that only one witness, Cynthia White, claims to have actually seen the entire incident, including Mumia shooting Officer Faulkner, a good journalistic question would have been, does this witness have any motivation to tell something other than the truth?
Well, they actually had only one witness who said that she saw everything from start to finish and that Mumia shot the officer first. Of course, that's Cynthia White, and she had 38 prior arrests and 3 pending cases. We found out that the 3 pending cases were never prosecuted. We found out that in 1987, 5 years later, when Cynthia White was arrested, she was released on bail for a serious charge, never returned to court, never was rearrested on a warrant. We found out that her boyfriend, who was also her pimp, when he was arrested, he was released at her request as well. I think all of the subsequent events demonstrate that the DA, I think, misrepresented to the court that a deal was made.
Veronica Jones, another prostitute on the street that night and one of the defense witnesses, has testified that she was offered the same immunity deal for her false testimony that Cynthia White received from the police.
All I had to do was name Mr. Jamal as the shooter. That's all I had to do. And they kept specifying that I would get the same deal as Cynthia White, and we called her Lucky. I would get the same deal as she got.
If it does not do a very thorough job at examining the witnesses on the prosecution side, does 2020 have a similar standard for the witnesses on the defense side?
Then there are the defense eyewitnesses. Leonard Weinglass says 4 people saw the real killer running from the scene. But his number 1 witness, William Singletary, waited more than a decade before testifying to a story so bizarre, even Weinglass has trouble defending it.
He said the shooter emerged from the Volkswagen, yelling and screaming, shot Officer Faulkner in the head and ran away. Whereupon, according to Singletary, Abu-Jamal approached the scene and said, "Oh my God, we don't need this," bent over Faulkner, who had been shot between the eyes, and asked, "Is there anything I could do to help you?" Whereupon, according to Singletary, Faulkner's gun, which was in Faulkner's lap, miraculously discharged, hitting Jamal in the chest. Now that's incredible.
He might be wrong on some of his timing. There's no doubt about that.
Timing? He's telling a story here which clearly from the forensic evidence couldn't have happened.
This is my point. The jury should have heard from Singletary.
Witness number 2 was a cab driver parked here, in plain view of the murder.
As the police arrived, he told one of the arriving officers, I believe a captain, the guy ran away. Those were his first words.
But the report from which Weinglass quotes goes on to say the shooter didn't get far and that he fell. And Weinglass's third witness, high up in a hotel room 1 block away, actually insisted that police were already on the scene when she looked out her window. And
she did not testify that she saw someone running away, simply that she saw someone running.
Yes, which was different slightly than the statement she gave the police.
Defense eyewitness number 4 was a prostitute standing on this corner 2 blocks away who, after 14 years silence, claims she saw 2 men jogging from the scene. She also admits to being, in drug lingo, half a nickel bag high.
Now, where was she? She was very far. She was, I mean, really, it's actually 2 streets. So I'd say it's beyond a football field.
You mean she's as far away as our camera?
I can't even see the camera.
In contrast, Prosecutor Joe McGill's 3 key witnesses were all within 50 feet of the shooting, and they gave essentially the same statement to 3 different police officers within 30 minutes of the murder.
The questions that Donaldson poses may be fair questions, but they are presented in a hostile way that seeks to totally discredit the witnesses. Here is Leonard Weinglass, presenting the defense version of these same witnesses.
In terms of what happened that night and who was the shooter, there were 5 witnesses who reported to the police that night or shortly thereafter that someone ran away. They all have that person running or persons on the same side of the street in the same direction. Either 5 people who were not together and didn't know each other, or in different parts of the street, were hallucinating about the same event, or the shooter did in fact run away.
Now, one of the things 2020 could have done was to actually go and interview these witnesses. They're not difficult to find. In fact, John Edgington, who produced the film on the case, did precisely that and talked directly to a number of them. Here's a segment of his interview with William Singletary, a local businessman and Vietnam veteran.
The police officer stopped the car, jumped out. The gentleman in Volkswagen met him. They had a brief confrontation. The cop had the guy to go up against the wall. As he went up against the wall, they was back and forth, verbal, talking back and forth, back and forth. And a guy was in the car, passenger. He jumped out, hollered some obscenities, and the police officer turned as if to say to him, get back in the car or something. And the guy pulled a handgun. And when he reached in his pocket and pulled a handgun, I just went behind the little thing there at the subway to get cover more or less because I figured it was a gun. And I heard a popping sound. I ducked. I saw the cop turn around, then I saw the guy point the gun directly at the cop's face. And then I saw the fire from the barrel hit the cop directly in the face. The guy turned around, looked at me, and then he turned the other way, placed the gun in the Volkswagen, took off running east on Locust Street. Another person appeared, and he asked me where was the guy driving the Volkswagen. I said he took off running down the street. He says, what happened here? I said, a police officer got shot. He said, oh my God, we don't need this. He walked toward the police officer, threw his hands up in the air, and as he leaned over to ask the cop, he says, is there anything I could do? And the cop's gun discharged, hit him in his chest, knocks him against the Volkswagen.
Another key defense witness that John Edgington spoke to was Veronica Jones.
I happened to be on the corner 12th and Locust, and I heard gunshots. We were standing there talking, I heard gunshots. I looked around the corner, and to my left angle, I saw a white male falling, a white person falling. I know it was male or female. And I seen 2 black males jogging away from the scene. That's what I saw.
What is significant is that neither William Singletary nor Veronica Jones gave this testimony at the trial. As a result, they both say of police intimidation. Here's William Singletary describing his experience that night at the hands of the Philadelphia police.
I remember clearly what I wrote, exactly what I told you, what I saw. I wrote it, and they said it wasn't good enough, it wasn't correct. They destroyed it, and I wrote it again. I did this over repeatedly for 4 times I did this. It was like 2 or 3 pages each time, and they would destroy it each time. I was threatened to be beat up. My parents were going to be harmed. My business was going to be destroyed. Everything that I worked for all of my life was going down the tubes. I was told basically, this guy's not worth it. He's a scum of the earth. I don't know why you taking up for him. You know, we know who did the shooting. Look, we got this guy. We're going to put him away. You're going to do what we tell you to do, or you won't be no good in the city. I wasn't going to let them beat me up, you know. But I knew if I hit one of them or something happened, I'd go to jail for some other charges or something I hadn't done. So when he gave me the offer to write something, I wrote, you know, he told me what to write. He told me word for word, that's what I wrote, that's what the guy typed on the paper. I signed the paper, 2 sheets, and I left. As I left, I felt like a lady would have felt if she was raped. I just felt violated. I knew what I did wasn't right. I knew everything that I stood for was down the tubes, and I felt real bad about it. And I knew this other person was being wrongly, falsely accused for something he didn't know. He never knew what happened.
I attach a lot of credibility to his very emotional statement that when he left the precinct that night, or the following morning, that he felt he had been raped. Because here is a man who worked with the police. He had a towing business and a gas station. The police were his friends. He doesn't say that. The police who testified said that. That Singletary had a very good attitude toward the police, and he was friendly to the police. His business depended on it. And yet he was abused and mistreated that night.
So if you were to tell this story with any sense of journalistic fairness, you would allow the defense to point out that rather than 3 witnesses, the prosecution only has 1 witness who claims to have seen the entire sequence of events, including Mumia twice shooting Officer Faulkner. And she, in fact, had very good reasons to give the police the story they wanted to hear. On the other hand, the defense has 5 witnesses who say they saw someone running away, and 1 person, William Singletary, who says he saw everything, including the shooter running away. Singletary also says that the key prosecution witness, Cynthia White, could not even see what happened from where she was at the time. And these people have no reason to lie. In fact, coming forward and telling the truth for Veronica Jones was pretty rough on her, as evinced by her being arrested right off the witness stand in the appeal hearing on an old bad check warrant she said she'd never even known about. Now that's an astounding display of police intimidation in broad daylight that tells us volumes about what may have been going on with witnesses behind closed doors before the trial. My question as a journalist is, how could you just ignore these witnesses, as they do in the 2020 story, and call this journalism?
The second plank of the prosecution's case is the ballistics evidence. Again, the prosecution and defense present 2 competing stories about this. The prosecution rests its case on trying to prove that the bullet removed from Officer Faulkner's gun was a .38 caliber bullet, the same caliber as Mumia's gun found at the scene. The defense case rests on a number of points. First, 2 key tests: whether Mumia's gun was fired that night and whether Mumia had fired the gun, that are routinely conducted were for some reason not done. Second, the police pathologist who removed the bullet from Officer Faulkner's body in his notes described the bullet as a .44 caliber bullet, not a .38 caliber bullet. Third, the police expert at the trial said that he could not match the bullet to Mumia's gun. And 4, 2 fragments of the bullet had gone missing, making it difficult to draw any conclusions from the available ballistics evidence. So how does 2020 treat the issue of the ballistics?
Jamal's supporters say the bullet that killed Officer Faulkner was .44 caliber, not a .38 like the gun found at the scene.
The fact that no ballistics tests were done, which is pretty stupid.
But ballistic tests were done and proved the bullet was fired by a .38 caliber revolver. The claim that the bullet was a .44 rests solely on a hasty note scribbled by a pathologist at the autopsy. However, the pathologist later testified that he had no expertise in ballistics, that he had only been guessing.
The police say that that slug has the lands and grooves consistent with being a .38 slug.
It does.
But if it's a .38, then your contention that it's a .44 is wrong.
Well, I think that issue is very much something that should be played out in front of a jury.
But it has already been played out in front of a judge, when 3 years ago, Wineglass's own ballistics expert testified the fatal bullet was a .38.
The caliber of the bullet is not central to Mumia's defense. What they didn't say was that when the police expert testified at the trial, he said he could not match that bullet taken from Faulkner's head to Mumia's gun. That was their expert. And he said he couldn't do that because, in his opinion, the bullet was too degraded to be matched. So while in the program they're talking about the caliber of the bullet being the same, they are omitting the fact that the police expert said he could not match the bullet to Mumia's gun because of the condition of the bullet.
One of the ground rules that journalists learn early and often is that, to be fair, you don't quote your sources out of context in a way that makes them seem to say something different than what they intended.
The fact that no ballistics tests were done, which is pretty stupid.
Now, Donaldson knew that Asner here was referring to the two standard tests that, for some unexplained reason, were not done on the scene that night. First, to determine if Mumia's gun had been fired, and second, to see if he had fired a gun. And yet, by altering the context of the quote, it's framed as though Asner is talking about the later lab test on the incomplete bullet, which he knows very well were done.
But ballistic tests were done and proved the bullet was fired by a .38 caliber revolver.
In journalistic terms, this kind of out-of-context manipulation is the equivalent of lying.
Actor Mike Farrell was interviewed along with Ed Asner by 2020. He describes how Sam Donaldson used this segment of their talk.
Ed knows ballistics tests were done. What he was referring to was the simple sort of primary ballistics tests, the sniff test, the paraffin test, that weren't done. And I jumped in to explain that. But of course they left my explanation out and just used his line. And it's a way to set people up, make them look like they don't know what they're talking about.
Ed Asner was absolutely right. They didn't test the weapon, and they didn't test Mumia's hands. And there's no explanation for that. They lost a key fragment of the bullet. There's no explanation for that. The pathologist said the bullet he removed was a .44 caliber bullet. There's no explanation for that. Does this ballistics evidence add up to proof of guilt, or does it add up to reasonable doubt? The ballistics part of the case favors Mumia very strongly, and yet in the program they treated it as if it favored the prosecution.
The third part of disagreement between the prosecution and the defense is based upon Mumia having apparently confessed to the killing on the night in question. The prosecution claims that at least 3 people heard Mumia confess to the killing of Officer Faulkner in the hospital. These people are Officer Faulkner's partner, Officer Gary Bell, Officer Gary Waukesha, and hospital security guard Priscilla Durham. The defense contends that these confessions are fabricated by the prosecution because it was fully 2 months after the event before anyone remembers that Mumia supposedly confessed. That Officer Gary Waukesha actually wrote in his report that night that Mumia made no comment, and that the attending physician reported that Mumia said nothing. So how does 2020 present these contrasting views of the confession?
Yes, Jamal had even confessed at the hospital, according to the slain officer's partner, Gary Bell.
We made eye contact, and he just shouted out that I shot the MFer, I hope he died.
And later, at a hospital, he blurts out what he did in an arrogant way.
Weinglass challenges the report of Jamal's hospital confession.
And that testimony was produced by the officer's partner, plus a security guard who wanted to be a police officer. More than 2 months later, they remembered that Mumia had said that.
It is a fact that the confession surfaced only after 2 months, and that one officer present originally reported the Negro male made no comments. But hospital security guard Priscilla Durham told the jury she reported it to her supervisor the next day. And another security guard, James LeGrand, says he too heard the confession. The slain officer's partner, Gary Bell, says the shock of the shooting suppressed his memory.
I've searched my soul, I've beaten myself up, wondering how I could not have gone at a sooner date, immediately even, and report what I had heard.
Finally, if there was a plot to fabricate a confession, then it had to include at least the 8 people involved in reporting and investigating it. An idea rejected by 2 separate appeals courts in the last 3 years.
2020 treats this fantastical confession as fact. Officer Bell gets to repeat his statement twice, and then is given a chance to explain why it took him 2 months to remember that someone confessed to his partner's murder on the night of the crime.
I'm sorry, a police officer, 2 police officers, heard this man confess and didn't think it was significant enough to mention it to anybody. The security guard didn't mention it for 2 months because she said she didn't think the police would think it was important. Any audience, the American audience that watches The Practice, would say, "Boo! What? What are you telling me? These guys are making this crap up, and they're trying to rig this trial." Well, of course they're not. If the intention of 2020 is to paint Mumia Abu-Jamal and his supporters as a bunch of crazed left-wing murderers and apologists, they're not going to ask the question that way. If, on the other hand, they want to get to the truth, that's of course the question they'll ask.
It's hard to believe that with Mumia allegedly confessing to having shot Officer Faulkner in the hospital, Officer Faulkner's partner, Officer Bell, did not report that confession which he claimed he heard for 63 days. That is just an unbelievable set of circumstances.
Defense's contention that Mumia said nothing that night is also confirmed by the doctor who attended him. You know, it's curious that this doctor somehow doesn't turn up in 2020's in-depth 4-month investigation.
I was with Jamal from within a moment or two of him being brought into the emergency room, throughout his entire time in the emergency room and on into intensive care unit, and he neither made any confessions to me, nor did he say anything that would be even remotely in the way of a confession to any other individuals once I was in his presence.
The bumper before they came back for one segment said, could a police officer have forgotten a confession?
Could a police officer forget a murder confession?
And I wrote him and I said, you know, it was interesting that you hyped that segment that way, but wouldn't it have been a little more honest to say, could 2 police officers have forgotten a confession and only remembered it 2 months after the fact when it was to their benefit to do so? You know, it's just, you get used to cheap tricks in my business. You get used to people without integrity. But I think the most hurtful piece of it is when people using cheap tricks and demonstrating their lack of integrity pose as journalists.
The idea of framing has a couple of different meanings. The one that most people know is when it is used in the context of criminal cases to falsely set someone up to look as though they are guilty. And some people have argued that's a pretty good way of describing 2020's behavior with regard to the Mumia Abu-Jamal case. The other idea of framing comes from the world of photography or filmmaking, where we can talk about how a scene is framed by the camera so that what is inside the frame appears in a particular way. At the same time, there are things left out of the frame which, if they were inside, would change the meaning of what is being shown. We've seen how 2020 adopts the prosecution's view to set up how the story is told. But this requires excluding from the frame the defense's contention that the original trial was unfair. As soon as it is included within the frame, then a whole series of other questions and issues have to be addressed. For example, the contention by the defense that the judge, Albert Sable, was inappropriate for a case of this kind was heavily predisposed towards the prosecution and made a number of unusual decisions against the defense. The judge refused to allow Mumia to represent himself and forced him to be represented by a lawyer who was both reluctant and ill-prepared. The defense was not given sufficient funds to gather all the necessary evidence, including expert testimony. That African Americans were unfairly excluded from the jury. In a city where African Americans make up 40% of the population, they made up only 14% of the jury. That inflammatory political comments attributed to Mumia when he was a teenager were used by the prosecution to persuade the jury to deliver a death sentence on him. Because of these irregularities, Amnesty International has concluded that numerous aspects of this case clearly failed to meet minimal international standards safeguarding the fairness of legal proceedings, and believes that the interests of justice would best be served by the granting of a new trial to Mumia Abu-Jamal.
I don't know if Mumia Abu-Jamal is guilty or innocent. I don't know what happened on that night in Philadelphia. And very few people do, in fact. There is a theory that the prosecution crafted, which they claim to have proven in court. But more importantly, if you look at the political context, the tone of the time in Philadelphia at that period, before and after, you understand the context of this trial.
Kicking him on the head.
Looking at how 2020 frames the issue of the trial is very telling. Here is the central issue that's motivated millions of people on this case. But 2020 devotes less than a minute out of a 20-minute story to the idea that the trial was unfair, and then only in the most general way. Ed Asner and Mike Farrell are not allowed to give any details. Remember, Donaldson's trying to portray them as know-nothing duped celebrities, so they have to be cut off if they start to sound knowledgeable.
I just know that the trial stunk, and the police malfeasance is sufficient. Witness flip-flopping all over the place is sufficient.
Ed Asner and Mike Farrell are just two of many Hollywood actors who believe the police, the prosecution, and the judge, Albert Sable, stacked the trial against Jamal.
And then, this is really bizarre, Donaldson says the problem with the trial was not that it was unfair, but that Mumia was unfair to the trial.
For 4 angry weeks, Abu-Jamal disrupted the courtroom, humiliated his own chosen attorney, insulted the jury, and threatened the judge with violence.
Another way in which the supporters of a new trial are discredited to 2020's audience is by inferring that they're almost like a religious cult. In fact, Donaldson actually uses the word disciple at one time to describe them.
To his most zealous disciples, Mumia Abu-Jamal is a prophet. To call him a murderer is sacrilege.
How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside?
People are not just going to sit back and let another Malcolm X be murdered and another Martin Luther King. Just like Jesus Christ, they were all freedom fighters, and they were all killed by this government.
The job of 2020 was deemed to be to paint the devil, Mumia Abu-Jamal, as the devil, and those of us who have fallen under his spell as being at least dupes, and at worst sort of co-conspirators with the devil.
There's a lot left out of the 2020 story, but perhaps the biggest omission is not to even name the organization that is leading the call for Mumia's execution, the Fraternal Order of Police, the largest police organization in the country. Maureen Faulkner did suffer a great loss, and our sympathy should go out to her, but she is not waging this campaign alone.
This individual assassinated a police officer in Philadelphia, and people such as Whoopi Goldberg, Ed Asner, Mike Farrell, Ozzie Davis, you have certain politicians who are sponsoring this benefit for a cop killer.
This is probably the biggest campaign in this nation's history to execute someone, and it's being led by police. Was 2020 unaware of the FOP's role in the campaign to execute Mumia? Not hardly. I'm afraid neither ignorance nor sloppy reporting can really explain 2020's bias in this story. In fact, if you want the smoking gun, or perhaps the smoking pen, that shows ABC knew exactly what they were doing, and from whose perspective they were going to tell this story, you just have to look at the letter that they wrote to Pennsylvania prison authorities when they were trying to get an interview with Mumia. They said explicitly that they're working with Maureen Faulkner and the Fraternal Order of Police. So this was never really journalism to start with. It was an exercise in persuasion, in rhetoric, really unadulterated propaganda masquerading as journalism.
It really should be studied by journalism students, I think, to show how can you take a serious story which would allow serious investigation and could perhaps raise some very provocative questions about policy, about criminal justice policy, about prisons, and instead make a mockery of it.
One of the main questions that arises out of all of this is why is there such a strong desire on the part of the mainstream media, as well as the justice system in general, to make sure that Mumia does not get a new trial? Clearly, there are some broader factors at work here.
I think the purpose of the 2020 video was in fact to establish the official, establishment, rational American liberal line, on what this particular case is all about. And I think that's necessary for two reasons. One is to head off those usually neutral Americans who don't like injustice, but who are not moved to do much about it unless it's something particularly egregious, and to keep them out of the support network, and to have them say, well, you may be concerned about this, but this is not a person worthy of your concern.
Mumia Abu-Jamal is not the first case where a large international movement has been created around a prisoner. Angela Davis, now professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, produced a similar reaction in 1970 when she was arrested and subsequently cleared on conspiracy charges.
Well, I think that precisely because his case brings together so many issues, and potentially there is a huge terrain on which support can be developed. Potentially, those who would speak out against the death penalty, and we do see a growing movement against the death penalty. Not only are they a potential force of support for Mumia, but they can be radicalized. In California, 2 years ago, the International Longshoremen's Union shut down the docks from Canada to Mexico on the day that was designated a day of solidarity with Mumia Abu-Jamal. And when I looked in the newspapers, I could find no indication at all that this major event had occurred. We can say that there has been a concerted effort on the part of the established media to prevent people from understanding the case of Mumia, to prevent people from becoming aware of the sort of major moments of support for him that, of course, might have the effect of drawing ever larger numbers of people into his campaign.
I think one thing that the society has learned since the 1960s is that you don't know where a movement will start. And the notion of everyday working class people in Montgomery, Alabama, starting a national movement based on sitting in the back and moving to the front of a bus is just ridiculous. I mean, you think about it. They didn't even ask to integrate the bus. All they wanted was to be able, if there were vacant seats, to move from the back over into the white section. Next thing you know, you have a nationwide movement with hundreds of thousands of people, rocking the society to the foundations. And so Mumia may be one person, right? But who's going to take a chance? Rosa Parks was one person. Look what happened with that. So now what you get is, if it looks like a spark, throw enough water on it right away so that it'll go out, And I think the overwhelming and clearly way, way, way excessive response to the Mumia case on the part of the establishment is that this might be a spark. We're not taking any chances.
The case of Mumia Abu-Jamal will reach some kind of conclusion soon as the appeals process works its way through the courts. And in fact, Mumia has recently broken his 20-year silence on the events of that night to reiterate his innocence. Americans do not like injustice, but they depend on the news media for their information about what constitutes injustice. It's crucial then to hold the media accountable for the stories they tell about matters of vital public interest. In the end, Mumia Abu-Jamal's life or death will literally depend on it. And when the state takes life, we are all implicated.